It's just unfathomable to think about that experience. And despite all the models that we have saying this is going to happen, that doesn't change what it's like to hear about the reporting in a war zone.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's very normal in human nature and human behavior to think that it won't happen to us. Unfortunately, like it did, it does. It's happened a number of times, even over just the past few years. We really need to do something about it. And a lot of the things that we can do are like pretty unpopular, but there are also things that we can do, on the broader scale.
Welcome to Climate Papa. This is a show about climate change, technology, and parenthood.
Well, welcome to episode 23 of Climate Papa, a show about the intersection of climate change, technology, and parenthood. And I'm your host, Ben Idelson. I invest in climate tech startups with a fund called Step Change, and I live in Seattle with my wife and our 3 kids. I'm a papa to a 6.5-year-old girl and 2 boys, a 4-year-old and an 8-month-old. There was a fire that burned for 29 hours in a major city. It destroyed over 17,000 buildings, killed over 300 people, and left over 100,000 homeless. This was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And out of the ashes of that fire, Chicago rebuilt itself into a global model of resilience. That disaster spurred major changes, including the use of fire-resistant building materials, much stricter safety codes, the expansion of the fire department, and the modernization of the water and sewer systems. It ultimately paved the way for Chicago to become the birthplace of the skyscraper and a leader in architecture and urban planning. The fires of LA are still burning. The devastation is immense and sad. To grasp for some meaning, I've been looking at the history of Chicago, not as some direct analogy, but as a beacon of hope that something long and lasting could come from the disaster we're watching now. That we could be collectively catalyzed to not just rebuild, but rebuild in a new and smarter way, in a way that could serve as a model for how things should be done around the world. That is my hope for Los Angeles and its amazing people. So to help process and understand the fire, how we got here, and where we might be going next, I reached out to our friends at Convective Capital. Long-term listeners might remember Convective Capital from our 3rd episode of Climate Papa back in the summer of 2023 when we spoke to Bill Clerico while the East Coast was having unprecedented wildfire smoke. Well, in a very fitting Climate Papa moment, Bill just welcomed his 2nd child into their family. Congratulations, Bill. And we have the pleasure of welcoming Jay from the firm on. Jay is a principal investor at Convective Capital and previously worked at Munich Re Ventures, a fund focused on reducing climate risk. He's a very deep thinker on all things fires and technology, and so happens to also be a fellow Papa. Welcome, Jay.
I'm Jay Ribakove. I'm a principal at Convective Capital, and I'm based in San Francisco. I have a daughter who's almost 2, and I have a son on the way.
Jay, thanks for coming on. I felt some urgency in having this conversation with you, much like I was looking back at the conversation I had with your partner, Bill, summer of 2023, when the East Coast fires were going on. And so we're in the active middle of a fire right now in Southern California and Los Angeles, which we will spend the majority of our time talking about. But before that, I want to hear about your life as a father for a minute.
I have a daughter who's almost 2. Her words are growing tremendously every day. We get some pretty hilarious ones. I get a lot of "I love you, Dad, Dad," but also "beep, beep, go away, Daddy" is a new combination that I'm not loving as much.
Some push and pull then.
Yep. We're getting a lot of independent play. I have a son on the way, so we've been reading lots of books about what it's like to be a big sister. We seem to be doing pretty well there, but watching my niece and nephew, it's going to be a big change.
Yeah. I'm excited for you guys.
Yeah, we're going to multiply the sleep deprivation, maybe exponentially. We'll see.
We are dealing with the post-holiday illness petri dish at multiple schools, and we're just like, it's very possible that both of our kids that go to school are out tomorrow, and we're just like juggling all the balls. So thank you for being willing to jump on in the evening because that actually makes this more possible. Thanks for some happy stories before we get into, I think, a pretty tough situation. Should we start with like high level where these fires are at and kind of like how to put this in context of fires that at least we've seen in the US?
Yeah, I mean, maybe let's talk about the size and kind of what's going on, and then we can put it in context and why it's such a scary and expensive fire, right? And what's been a little bit different. But I looked a couple of hours ago. I think the Palisades fire, which is the largest fire, it's burned close to 40,000 acres at this point, and it's 17% contained. The Eaton fire, which is the next largest, is 12 or 13,000 acres and is 33% contained. And then the Hearst, Kenneth, Sunset, and Lydia fires are all north of 95% contained in aggregate, around 2,000 acres. And so the acreage itself is not huge in the sense of California wildfires, but it's really that this turned into an urban conflagration, right, in a tremendously expensive city. And so part of what that means when you think about it in a climate aspect is you're not only burning trees and vegetation, but you're burning quite a lot of chemicals, plastics, gasoline, things that are going to, hopefully we'll see a slowdown in this fire and maybe some eastward wind bringing in some additional humidity. But that's going to blow really, really harmful smoke in a lot of different places. So something that's scary there. And then of course, like more than anything, there's also this human toll. I think right now there's 24 dead, there's 23 missing. I want to say there's 15,000 first responders who are on site. And the numbers that I'm seeing in terms of economic losses also 30 billion in insured losses, 135 to 150 billion dollars in total economic losses.
Over 12,000 buildings.
And then we're going to have this continued housing shortage. Like LA was already suffering from extreme housing shortages, and that's going to be made worse. And so there's like really some human suffering and devastation, loss of life, memories, losses of homes. Like this is a tragedy.
From a fire perspective, I guess in recent times, we've now had these waves of large economic fire losses. Right? This might be kind of a scale that's unprecedented recently. Does this almost echo back to the great urban fires, perhaps before we had urban firefighting infrastructure? Does this almost echo back to like the Great Chicago Fire and others that you hear about in the history books?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Honestly, in terms of its devastation, I was thinking about it more like hurricanes.
Yep.
Who, the extreme hurricanes typically have just tremendous amounts of destruction and both human and economic loss, like I expect we're going to see here in LA. The Chicago fire, I think we also learned a lot from the Chicago fire. A lot of the way that we actually build buildings and cities and current mechanisms and approaches for fighting urban and suburban fires were learned there. And so hopefully, here we get better, and like we have to do everything we can to make sure a fire like this doesn't happen again.
What were the conditions that set this up? And I mean, I do think there's something worth getting to some explicit perspective, which is there is some debate around like the intersection between fires and climate, and like would love to hear your take on the conditions that got us to a fire of this scale.
I think in general, right, we're seeing more climate and natural catastrophes. I think over the last, historically, fires were fairly frequent with low to moderate intensity. And then I believe it was in the 80s that changed to a regime of, fires must be put out with expediency. And what that means is that we have a much denser fuel load, which again, LA is sort of an urban conflagration and a little bit different here, but much denser forests and generally a problem. In LA specifically, like there's two very clear things that set this up to be so dangerous. You had the Santa Ana winds that everyone's talking about, and these are just very strong and dry. They create a low humidity environment where flames can spread rapidly and embers can be carried really just anywhere. And the other is this almost weather whiplash, if you will. So there's a ton of rain down in Southern California this past spring, and it created explosive growth, plant growth. And then that was followed by a very hot summer and a delayed start to rainy season. So you have a large volume of fuel just waiting for a spark. I mean, you combine that with the Santa Ana winds, and I don't know that there's really so much that could have prevented these fires, certainly how extreme they were, perhaps, but from starting and from growing, we are going to have fire. Like, that's a reality of California, much of the West, and even a lot of, the continental United States at this point. I saw a chart just today that said that every state except for Delaware experienced some level of wildfire, which was actually surprising to me.
A full national issue. Yeah, I guess perhaps it's like what makes California unique. I mean, it might be some of these events like the Santa Ana winds that can cause this level of spreading and speed of growth of a fire, but also maybe the distance between wild forest and property and human life.
That's right. And then, once you've entered an urban area, the same techniques that work for fighting wildfires no longer work. Traditionally, firefighters in wildfires don't use water to fight the fire. The aerial suppression is really designed to allow firefighters to go in and do things like build breaks. And once you're in an urban area, the priority shifts to not from stopping fire, but to evacuating people and saving lives. And so it's a very different environment, and we're building in fire-prone areas.
Maybe this is just like the particular corners of the internet that I consume the spectrum of, but I think that people want to, as usual, simplify fairly complex systems and say the whole issue here is blah. The whole issue here is blah. And it sounds like, at least how I'm interpreting it, is really this is a complex system that's the combination of a few things. Numerous of those things are lagging impacts of climate change and a warming planet, whether that's a big rainy season in spring that then could be delayed, or dry conditions for a year. These things are also not unmodeled. From what I understand, most of the people that have been modeling this are like, yeah, this type of event from the extreme Santa Ana winds to drought to the dry conditions is kind of predicted every 15 years or so at this point in time. It's unprecedented as an outcome because it's historic and not what we're used to, but it's not surprising to the people that have been predicting what might happen in the region. Is that aligned with what you've seen?
That's right. I think it's sort of these exacerbating factors. What's been interesting is we haven't seen a tremendous growth in the number of wildfires. What we're seeing is a tremendous growth in the destruction and the extreme nature of fires. If I were to look at that, there's probably some clear ties to climate. Our work, focuses a little bit less, on the sources, from a ultra macro perspective, and a bit more on like, what can we do assuming that this is going to continue to happen?
Yeah. I mean, the macro is this is going to continue to happen and continue to happen more than it is now, which is a hard pill to swallow, especially watching this. And given that, then what? Like, what tools do we need that we don't have? So maybe that's where we should turn to next, which is what could we have done differently if we had better tools with all the knowledge that we have now, and what's kind of our path through this?
So there's this concept in cybersecurity actually called defense in depth, and it's basically a layering of multiple strategies. And our view is that to be effective at stopping catastrophic wildfires, we need a similar defense in depth strategy. So if we were to think more specifically around LA, but this can be applied pretty generally, it's landscapes, communities, response, and then ultimately also recovery. What do we do after this? And so we've been investing pretty aggressively in all of these, in landscapes, and I'll use some portfolio company examples just because it's easier to talk about. We're in BurnBot, which is a robotics platform for fuel treatment. It allows more economically efficient and also faster thinning of vegetation and forests, and then prescribed burns. We're in a company by the name of Overstory that helps utilities with vegetation management, basically preventing trees and branches and leaves from touching power lines. And we're also in a company called Gridware that allows utilities to detect faults in real time. One of the main causes is when those tree branches do touch power lines, how do you immediately de-energize those lines so that they're less likely to start a fire? And then same thing, like how do you get them back online so it's of minimal disruption to customers? Mm-hmm. And then moving into this communities, what can we do to prepare? So things like creating defensible space and home hardening. Fireside is one of our portfolio companies that helps municipal and county fire departments that do this at scale and communicate with their constituents effectively. Historically, this is an analog process, and it's very, very hard to incentivize homeowners and neighborhoods to take this action. And it's even harder to do if you're doing it on a one-to-one basis, where a firefighter has to go and actually talk to every single resident, try to encourage action and also help those residents figure out what the right actions are. And then you've got the response side. So, once we do have a fire, can we detect it sooner? Can we give firefighters information about really how is the fire behaving? And so Pano in our portfolio is a really good example of that. And then we continue to look. Today, we actually wired funding for a novel suppression startup. I won't say too much more about it, except to say that we're really excited and we feel like, we need to do all of these things to prevent fires, to harden our communities, but fires are going to happen. And what do we do then? And then on the recovery side, there's a lot to do when we think about rebuilding homes and rebuilding infrastructure. But insurance is probably the most top of mind conversation today. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I used to work at Munich Re, so thinking about this quite a bit lately, and I've had some interesting conversations. And I think there are new models like what our portfolio company Stand is doing, where they actually work with potential policyholders to give them recommendations on actions that they can take to become insurable. But we also need to work at the policy level. Can we, and this is starting to happen, can we allow insurers to price in, the cost of reinsurance and look at future climate risk? And if we do that, I think we're going to see folks continue to participate in the California insurance markets. It's just so big, and insurers, like everyone else, need growth. And by pulling out of California, it has the opposite effect. Just yesterday, I was talking to an exec at one of the larger U.S. insurance companies, and what she was saying was, she's had some conversations about folks who are going to opportunistically come into California. And these are folks who maybe aren't even writing in California today. And they're going to price their policies at an absolute premium if they can. But in my mind, that is so good, right? That is critical that we have new participants who are coming to play because they feel like they can earn a reasonable premium for the risk that they're taking.
If I were to play back the kind of funnel that you just walked through my head from kind of the cybersecurity lens into fire security, this gets to a meta kind of macro rant that I have on this whole kind of human psychology around natural disasters, which is, if a foreign adversary launched a bomb on Los Angeles and it killed 25 to 50 people, flattened 12,000 buildings, caused air quality throughout the region to spike, and kind of the society at large kind of twiddled its thumbs and said, well, I guess that's just how it is, And similarly, when a hurricane hits in the Southeast and similar levels of damage and devastation happen to homes and to people's lives, and people just kind of twiddle their thumbs and say, well, I guess that's how it is. There's something about our inability to grasp that there's an analogy to national defense. There's an analogy to saying, if we want to be a robust civilization over the next 20 to 60 to 80 years, there is a reality that we need to start to face, which is we have a new, call it what you want. I'm comfortable calling it an enemy because it's trying to kill people I love and damage things that I love. So why not call it an enemy? It's psychologically, I think, more convenient when, an enemy can be represented with a human face and you can put a dictator's image on and say, they're trying to bomb us, right? But the outcome is not that different. And you know what? We're pretty lucky in the continental US. We have not had a missile hit Southern California from a foreign enemy. But this is a real thing that is happening, and it's happening with an increasing frequency. And I get frustrated that we don't tap into the same degree of psychology that we are able to tap into for national defense when it comes to national defense of our property, of our people, of our civilization. And I think that manages to mobilize a different economic and policy response than we've been able to mobilize around ultimately adaptation and resilience, which is the category of defense, I think, that we're here to talk about, as well as, the proactive things, which might be the category of future mitigation. I don't know if that resonates for you at all, or if you've thought of it that way, but
I've heard it said a few different ways, but natural security in this case is national security. Defense against catastrophic events is also national security. So I absolutely view it as that way. And we've just even heard startups who are talking about it in this way. Folks who are thinking about is there a possibility of, an act of terrorism where someone is performing arson in national forests or in remote places that take us a long time to spot, or a cool startup out of Israel called Fire Dome, which is modeled after Iron Dome and takes a similar approach to putting out fires. I think this is critical, and you talked about it right from the human cost, but I think the driver here will be that the economic costs are becoming very noticeable to deep-pocketed customers, utilities being at the forefront of that. And, from everything I'm reading, the Los Angeles fires don't seem like, certainly not the Palisades fire, don't seem like they were utility caused. But right now we have massive lawsuits going on against Pacific Corp. You had the Camp Fire and in 2018, PG&E filing bankruptcy. You just had the lawsuits against Hawaiian Electric. And you can kind of go on and on with this. And so I think regardless of how people feel about climate issues, fire is really unique in that it burns orange, right? It's both red and blue, and it's costing people a lot of money. And so we don't even need best intentions anymore.
No.
We have economic incentives as well.
Yeah. So say then that you have that, it sounds like to funnel through, I'm trying to map kind of all the portfolio that you walked through. It's okay, given that fires are going to happen, it's like, let's reduce the severity that they're going to have when they do hit, property lines. So that's everything around, can we do better managing the forests, right? Can we automate that? Can we do better planning? Can we do a better job on the kind of on the thinning of forests? Then I think it was, can we reduce in particular the probabilities that utilities are going to cause more wildfires? I think we all want to keep electricity in our life, and I don't want that to cause wildfires. So let's make sure we get the best tools possible to utilities so they know how to invest. And then let's build harder homes and harder communities so that once you actually get out of the forest into a property, there's increased resilience in the property, right? And how we build the actual property and community. So that sounds like one wave. Is that kind of right?
That's right. And you touched on something in there, which is sort of this enabling, or this, for utilities and others, how do you plan? It's not only the immediate actions, but how do you think in capital investment type cycles, right? Where you're going to be deploying hundreds of millions or billions, or in larger utilities cases, even tens of billions of dollars. We have a company in our portfolio who's thinking about that called Rhizome, who I think,
a shared investment,
pretty well as well. We have another not announced investment sort of contemplating the other side of that, which is like, what's the best place to put new assets, whether that's load or generation or even storage, so that you can stabilize the grid and minimize the impact of some of these cautionary activities. Like when you do a public safety power shutoff, how can you de-energize a smaller amount of the grid? Or, when you want to turn power back on, how can you maybe get energy to flow in different directions, actually, which is something that's tremendously difficult. And even thinking about, hey, what are the future sources of energy, right? And if utility scale solar, for example, is going to be the largest producer of energy going forward, how do we protect those assets? And, a big part of that is utility scale solar sits above dry brush and grass, typically very near to, again, suburban and sometimes even urban areas. And so we invested in a company called On-Site Robotics, who helps monitor for all of those risks. And so we're thinking, definitely in all the areas that you said, but also even the enabling technologies around that.
And we've talked about some companies in this space, which is like, can you reduce? I mean, I guess there's the utility started fires, there's lightning started fires, there's other potential scenarios. Like, what are the tools that could reduce, the starting of a given fire, which is an interesting category. Then it's a fire is happening. What can accelerate our response or help steer our response? So it's, what are the drones that could respond, automatically? What are the things that can give additional intelligence to responders and everything around that? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, I'm pretty sure it's them, funded research that said that a 15-minute reduction in response times in California would save somewhere between $3 and $8 billion in California alone every year. And that's because fires grow exponentially worse with time. Let's say you're 15 minutes into a fire, at minute 30, it's not twice as bad.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's intuitive from two dimensions once you think about it. The first is like temperature. If you started a fire in your fireplace at home or a campfire, like it's hard to get going. And then once it's going, you like throw a log on it and it's just going to keep going. These kind of starting temperature versus once it's taken off. And then it's this, obviously the surface area and how big is the circumference of the fire. And then in this case, even more so with winds speed, accelerating that. I think, you think about 100, everyone's like, okay, 100 mile per hour winds. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that an ember of lit material is going to go 100 miles per hour in speed to light the next thing. That is absolutely insane to think about, how fast that fire can spread then, which is why a given person trying to make decisions around evacuating their home and all of this is, I mean, I am amazed actually. I mean, I think there's lots to diagnose and postmortems, and I'm no expert on this, but I'm actually amazed that there weren't more loss of life numbers given how fast the fire was spreading from that perspective.
I think that's right. And I think you have to, give credit where credit is due. And the first responders in LA, who I think the number I saw was like 100,000 people were evacuated. And to get that messaging out, amazing. And I think, I want to credit also, we're very close with the team at Watch Duty and some of the work they did so that, everyday folks could get information faster.
Makes a huge difference to people surviving in these scenarios.
Totally. I don't know if you had a chance to watch any of the videos of the fire, but you can hear the noise. I mean, it sounds like you're on the inside of a NASCAR racetrack with all the cars going by. It's like deafeningly loud and terrifying.
Yeah, these moments of Sunset Boulevard's backed up, and like if they want to make it down the hill, they got to abandon their car and run, and being told to do that by first responders, and it's just unfathomable to think about that experience. And despite whatever, all the models that we have saying this is going to happen, that doesn't change what it's like to hear about the reporting in a war zone.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's very normal in human nature and human behavior to think that it won't happen to us. Unfortunately, like it did. It does. It's happened a number of times, even over just the past few years. We really need to do something about it. And a lot of the things that we can do are like pretty unpopular, but there are also things that we can do, on the broader scale. We should absolutely be changing NEPA. Like to do some of the prescribed burning and forest thinning, to be bogged down in paperwork and, regulatory approvals and years of environmental approvals. It's broken. And there are things that, we can fix with regulatory change in relatively short order. And then there are other, much harder, much longer challenges, but we should be knocking those off. And then, I think there's also like a responsibility on all of us too, to do some of these things, like to do the home hardening and create some defensible space. No one wants 5 feet without beautiful flowers and vegetation in front of their home, but you also don't need to necessarily go 100% of the way. It doesn't have to be cement, right? It can be, species that are significantly less prone as a middle ground.
Right. I mean, this maybe gets to like where to go from here. And it feels to me like when it comes to, a particular homeowner or community or this whole region of LA, for example, you have a bunch of things that can kind of within a spectrum can like nudge some number of points towards a more adaptive situation, right? So whether that's a home making a number of upgrades or a community making a number of upgrades or installing various technologies, Similarly, I think on the insurance side, allowing better pricing of risk and allowing more novel pricing of risk than the historical models might open up more insurers to come in and be able to kind of make that a sustainable market. At the same time, I was texting with someone who lives in LA, not in this region, but not too far from it, about the conversation we were going to have. And maybe this is just the feeling down there, but like putting aside the optimism for a minute and the solutions that, might move things forward for a minute, is there a point for some regions and some places where it's like, no, this is actually just not a safe place to live anymore, or an economically reasonable? There's always a way to make it safe if you build a concrete bunker, but like, we're not going to do that for every house. Like, how do we think about that in the spectrum?
I don't think we're ever going to stop fires entirely. Nor do I even know that, every fire is bad. But what we really can't have is these crises where, entire towns or neighborhoods, or in this case, cities, are burning. And there are certain things that are, collectively, economically quite reasonable. Creating defensible space outside of a neighborhood, that has tremendous impact. And some of the defensible space and, even simple things like gutter guards. If you can stop a couple of homes from lighting, you stop the fire from spreading. It doesn't have to be unduly burdensome. It's just deeply unpopular today. We're not going to see people en masse leave California, just like, a lot of the Southeast, experiences hurricanes and people continue to live there. They're very desirable places to live. They create a ton of value to their residents and to the country and to the world at large. And so I don't think we're at that place. I think we have other climate-related disasters that are more likely to force people to need to migrate in the way of drought and extreme heat than wildfire, given that there are actions that we can take to prevent extreme catastrophic events. That's it. Like,
you're disagreeing fundamentally with the premise of the question, which is to say, no, actually, this is a category of catastrophe that we actually can prepare for and have a degree of management for, that we don't have to accept, in these regions if we chose not to, and we put in the investment across various dimensions to manage it.
That's right. And then, for the hopefully much smaller group of folks that's unlucky, like that's what insurance or risk transfer mechanisms are built for, right? That's exactly the purpose. It's just that they're not set up to protect us and help us recover from events of this scale.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, then, let's say I had kind of, 2 or 3 categories in my mind where I'd love your advice. If you are a homeowner who is in, a region that, at various times in the last 5 years, you've had evacuations, or maybe you haven't been in the hot spot, but you're in a location of relevance when it comes to fires. What should you do if you're listening to this?
Oh man, I'm now going to sound like a broken record, but create defensible space and harden your home. Like, they're not that expensive, relatively speaking, and they're easily achievable.
So tactically, what do I search for to go do those 2 things?
Oh man, you're just, forcing me to push my portfolio companies, but like, go, down to your local fire department, get them to get Fireside and tell you and all your neighbors, exactly what they can do on their homes.
Okay, got it. Fireside will help the fire department help you figure out what to do.
Yeah. How do you do this for the whole neighborhood? Because you're way safer if, it's not only you, if it's your neighbors doing the same thing.
Okay. So that's the top call to action for a homeowner that might care. Let's say you're a, exploring tech founder and all of a sudden you're hyper activated by this moment and by this conversation, and you want to start the next most impactful fire tech startup. What areas and ideas do you feel like are most underexplored that are worth spending effort and cycles researching?
As another venture investor, I feel this tremendously well, but we learn from, the founders who come to us all the time on really interesting approaches to solving problems. Lately, some of the areas we're fascinated by are, new approaches to suppression in making some of this thinning and improving the economic viability of forests better so that we can do a lot of these activities and not just in sort of a benevolent action, but actually in a for-profit mindset, because that's going to drive a lot more work. Those are a couple of areas. And then also, how do we make first responders more efficient, right? Whether that's call centers, whether that's resource allocation, making them safer, allowing them to go into homes with a much less or much smaller percentage chance of getting hurt. Those things are also really important. And I think only going to be more so. Like, we have to get people to do these otherwise dangerous and hard jobs.
Yeah. Maybe I'm overusing the analogy, but it's just top of mind. If anything in defense tech you think is like cool or interesting because it's just the bleeding edge of kind of a complicated set of technology, or you watched a lot of movies in your childhood and you're like, okay, Anduril and all these things seem really like exciting times, but you want to go work on something that's going to cause domestic defense. Like, let's go give firefighters superpowers, right? Like,
one of the areas we talk about regularly is, fire tech mirrors defense tech in 2016, when Anduril was getting started, and, fintech in 2008, when it was received wisdom that like only a bank can be innovative and can make a difference here. And then commercial space, like in 2002, who wants to sell to governments? And we kind of think fire tech is that, 2025.
And then, maybe this echoes, but for a potential job seeker, maybe you're an engineer or someone at Google, Meta, you're listening to this and you're like, you know what, it's time to go work on a problem like this. Do you have a aggregated jobs page or particular companies people should poke around looking at?
Yeah, we have a job board.
Great.
It's up to date. It's just like every other VC. And I would also encourage folks to apply to attend the Red Sky Summit. We're really lucky that the fire tech community is one that's looking to bring in people from all different domains, right? From insurance, from utilities, from government, from technology, first responders. And it's such a good way to learn and be introduced to folks who all of them kind of share this mission from different angles of getting rid of this risk and stopping these catastrophes. And so that doesn't happen all the time, but honestly, I feel it's like and I'm biased about this because, we very much help bring it together. I think it's an amazing resource.
I mean, I think it speaks to the vacuum that existed in the market that says, hey, like these folks need to be talking and want to be, and there's not a place for them. So thank you for putting it together. And I've already heard from founders and others in the space how valuable it's been. And I very much hope to be there next year. So thanks for putting on the Red Sky Summit. I'll link to all of this, obviously, in the show notes. Thank you, Jay. Thanks for coming on post bedtime and in the middle of a very hectic week. I know a lot's been going on, so I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. Super fun conversation. I know you're also funding a number of these companies yourself. And yeah, it's past my bedtime. I try to go to sleep not too late after my daughter does. So we'll sign off here before I turn into a pumpkin.
Smart move. All right. Thanks, Jay. Well, that's a wrap on episode 23 of Climate Papa. My heart goes out to all of those affected by this disaster and all of the people of Los Angeles. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, please subscribe or follow in the podcast player of your choice or directly at climatepapa.com, and we'll email you when the next episode comes out. And as always, here's the Balkan Pop remix of Mellow Kind of Hype by Lazy Syrup Orchestra to take us out.
On we go like...